Are in internship, so I expect you know enough about the models and things to be participating. And so yeah, just go with me. So obviously you guys know Bowen's work. The theory has a lot of different models. I've always called it Bowen theory, but I know here at Capella, it's often referred to as multi-generational theory, intergenerational theory. You might see Bowenian family therapy, all that kind of stuff, right? Same thing, no difference. But like I said, I want to talk about differentiation of self. And so before we kind of go there, I want to know, what do you guys know about differentiation of self? What have you been taught? What are your thoughts? I'm going to make you talk right off the bat.
I could start off. My understanding is that it's combines like two things. One is the ability to be with yourself, and the other is sort of the ability to be in relationship with others. So to not lose yourself while you're in relationship with others, so to maintain relationships, but also to be connected to yourself.
Yep. I think that's a big part of it. Yeah. Anybody else? Oh, yes.
I can go next. So it emphasizes on differentiating between thoughts and feelings, and interpersonal and intrapersonal differentiation. Like if one of our family members or the client's family members are going through an emotional turmoil, it's not that everyone has to have the same feeling. So yes, people need to differentiate.
Yeah.
And then I have done so many papers on Bowen, so I can talk about all the 8 concepts, but this is the main thing. Other than that, triangulation and emotional cutoff and projection. So
yeah,
all those things.
All the big 8 concepts, right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, then that's part of why I wanted to talk Bowen today. I love it. I think there's so much about it, and it's so much more, or there's a lot of that theoreticalness to this model. You know, I think that there's a lot to talk about. And I will say right off the bat, like, I hope you guys know this is my interpretation and my training and learning about it. Obviously, like, I am not the know-all on Bowen. I do not, claim to talk and know exactly what he said, but this is, like I said, kind of my thoughts on it. And that's why I want to know, what you guys have really learned and know about it yourselves. Anyone else have any thoughts? Those were both spot on, but anything else you've learned, or maybe like you think there's like a conception or a certain thought about it when it comes to differentiation? And I really am going to talk a lot about it, what it looks like clinically with clients. I just want to know if there's any other, before I shut it down, or if I can't see the chat, I don't see anything in it. So
Again, say one more thing: the ability to self-soothe, to take care of oneself when you feel a reactivity, to be able to soothe oneself without relying on sort of other people to soothe you.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I'm going to call that thought anxiety tolerance is the language I'm going to use, but it's that kind of thing that just because everyone else in the system or the group is being reactive, can you maintain yourself regardless of, right? And we know with Bowen, it's that emotional process, that chronic anxiety is present, that's always going on, and every group has a certain level, and you're probably in multiple different groups, right? And so can you maintain and soothe yourself and not get caught up in the anxiety of everybody else? Yeah. Oh, yes. Anna Lynn, yes. That's kind of a Gottman term, the self-soothing part. And I will say I learned a lot of my Bowen stuff from Dr. Christopher Burnett. He teaches at Nova, and he's where I get the term anxiety tolerance from. And so he's a strictly kind of Bowen guy. And I agree, and I think it's a really systemic concept, like you talked about with the both and, how you are in self and how you are in relationship. So good point. I will say, and what I think sometimes happen is I think differentiation of self gets a little misunderstood. I think, and this is partially for me teaching the early classes, this is when people first get to know the theories. And I think for a lot of beginning therapists, people latch on to differentiation of self. And we all like this idea, right? This idea that we could kind of elevate our level of emotional regulation or whatever, and kind of increase our differentiation of self. And what would that look like? And so then I think this is what happens is people kind of have this idea, right? It's a scale, it's 0 to 100. It's a lot of times, especially how it was talked about. And there's this space from like 0 is like a bad score. It's like a low one. You don't have any self or any differentiation. And 100 is like, you're at this Maslow's hierarchy of just self-actualization that you're, totally differentiated. Okay. We'll have to talk about Dr. Burnett sometime then. Yeah. He's fun. It's fun to talk about him with other theories, and he has really strong thoughts about different ones.
Yes, I was one of the people that when he first came in, I always joke I put the gray in his hair. So I was a student of his too.
Oh yeah. I came to his class very skeptical of Bowen and very language-based myself and the models I liked. And so I had this similar experience where there's a lot of kind of, not conflict, but differing of opinions.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think, probably a lot of us have been in that space where we think we want to help ourselves or clients like increase our differentiation. And I think that some people have this thought that, once you do that, you got therapy, you've done your own work a little bit, that now you're kind of good. And now you have that ability to have some extra anxiety and tolerance or self-soothing, whatever language you want to say, and then you can better manage yourself. Right. And I think some of that's true. I'm not saying like none of that's accurate. But I just think there's more to the concept that sometimes we're leaving out. Because I think Bowen would talk about and say, and you'll see, it's a couple of slides, but it's really hard to change a level of differentiation. And so what I'm going to talk about, and I don't want to get like too crazy theoretical here, but some other ways to maybe think or expand about differentiation. And, so like over here, we're keeping in mind that we're individuals, yes, but we were always part of a group or really multiple groups. You're a part of a group right now, Capella, your family system, when you're at work, when you're at any place. And every group's going to have certain levels of energy or kind of what we're going to call like a overall typical level for them as far as like differentiation kind of goes. Okay, so I'm kind of defining differentiation as what we talked about is how people regulate the forces that act upon them as an individual and a group in the context of the emotional systems you're a part of. Okay, so all that's happening in context. Like I said, that groups tend to have different levels of this. Like we know, and especially if you're in internship, you're working with families, different families have different levels of this. Some people are very, very close that nothing happens where everyone's not involved and everyone's not anxious and kind of freaking out. And other families, there's a lot of cutoff, which is that kind of, more extreme or people, or maybe they're in the middle where people can kind of regulate themselves, so everyone's different. And I think that when it comes to differentiation for individuals, it's a very variable concept. And it happens to increase or decrease a lot based on the current emotional system you're in and the level of anxiety in that system, right? So in any given time in the systems that maybe the anxiety is really high or low, and as we know with Bowen, right, the higher the anxiety, normally the lower the rational thought. And so that's going to have an impact on the emotional system. So that's what I'm going to show next. It's kind of maybe a different thing than that scale, a different kind of chart to think of differentiation on. And so I think any individual's level of differentiation is more dependent on the group they're in, the intensity of that, the intensity of the anxiety, how that group looks. Because, with a group, right, the group, Bowen's all about survival, right? I think a lot of it boils down to that. It's a natural systems-based concept, so everything boils down to survival. Well, the group wants to survive. So the group is constantly pulling individuals to give to the group. That's what's happening. The group is not so worried about the individual's kind of state of survival, but the group is always wanting the individual to give, right? to help them ensure their survival. So in a way, differentiation of self is you managing that pull. Are you going to give in to the pull of the group to give your resource and energy there? Or are you going to fight that energy and seek to maintain yourself? Does that make sense at all? Are we tracking? Okay. And so I like to think about it as this kind of, it's a constant choice people are making all the time, and not necessarily some level that people achieve and stay at. But at any given moment, you're navigating, the group's always pulling you, or your client, or whoever it is. And you're making a choice all the time. Am I going to give in to what the pull of the group wants, or am I going to manage myself, whatever that looks like? So this is from Dr. Burnett. I'm not going to even try to claim that this is for me. But this is kind of how that looks like in a chart form of, differentiation of self is on one axis, but it's really, really dependent on the level of anxiety in the system. So even if, like, obviously when the anxiety is lower, it's a lot easier to be a little higher on the scale, or in terms of where your differentiation is. Versus the higher the anxiety, a lot of times it's a lot more difficult to maintain differentiation. And there's probably more times where people are going to be more towards the group than they are towards themselves, and we've kind of gone over this part. So Bowen calls differentiation of self a fusion of intellect and emotion. And it's that kind of balance of individuality and togetherness, like we talked about. And as I said, it's all really boils down to the fact that the higher the anxiety is, the higher everyone's emotion is, the higher that the reactivity in the system, and thus the lower the level of intellect and rational thought and thoughtfulness. Okay, so you're kind of, the more that anxiety increases, especially people who don't have an ability to tolerate anxiety, the harder and harder it is to fight that fusion when it happens. And to me, right, an ultimate goal in Bowen is, how do we remain thoughtful and calm and rational, regardless of the intensity of the emotional system or the level of anxiety? Any thoughts on anything? I don't want to run through it, but is anything coming up? Anyone want to add or talk about anything so far? Going once, going twice. Okay.
Quick question.
Yes.
Is it, that wasn't very nice.
It was.
This is something that always comes up is it only anxiety, or is it also anger, fear, frustration, sadness, or is it only anxiety?
So I guess, oh, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, this won't be the debate of the faculty, but that all those things Bowen talked about as anxiety, anxiety was a blanket term for all of those emotions.
Sure. I mean, the faculty understand that, the three of us, but I think that a lot of students or, early interns are not clear about that. And so that's why I was wanting our speaker to wax loquacious on that, please.
Yes, well, good point. Yeah, so I think that's a great point that I probably should have clarified, is that anxiety in Bowen is not anxiety in the clinical sense that you talk about anxiety with your clients, right? It's not talking about what the DSM is talking about with like feeling anxious or symptoms of anxiety. Like Dr. Bamman said, it is that kind of fusion of intellect and emotion. So it's going to refer to any strong emotional pull, regardless of if that's fear, anger, loneliness, sadness. And I don't know why he chose a term that was already kind of had such a connotation to it, but it does. And that is something, like I said, I should have mentioned, anxiety has a very different meaning to Bowen than it does probably to most people listening, which is why it's hard to talk about this stuff with clients. In some models, you can be pretty overt and kind of say, here's what we're doing. Like Gottman that Dr. Scully brought up, that's a pretty easy one where you can say, we're talking about contempt and this and that. It's hard to talk about Bowen, I think, in terms with clients sometimes with this, because if you're not really knowing for sure, and until you're better trained on what anxiety looks like and is, they're extra confused if you start talking about anxiety this, anxiety that. They might be like, I'm not anxious, I don't have anxiety. Well, not the way that you think, but the way I'm understanding it through Bowen, there is anxiety in the system.
Even like falling in love could be like an anxiety in that sense, right? You could lose yourself completely to the group.
I agree. I think that's a huge time where anxiety is very high. A lot of changes are happening, and talk about having to balance togetherness and individuality. You know, I got married about 6 months ago, right? And it's like, man, and I know all about this, and it's just hard to manage the balance of those things. We were talking about it today, because you're dealing with really high levels of anxiety because of the change and just like the strong emotions that are present. Any other ways you guys see anxiety come out that's not necessarily like, right, anxiousness?
No, I really like that you said that. Like I hadn't thought loneliness, but yeah, I could see how loneliness might tempt one to triangulate in stuff like
I also-
food or drugs or whatever.
Yeah.
Oops, sorry, school. Another thing is emotional cutoff is anxiety. It might look like you're not anxious at all because you're disconnected. You're, in your own little sphere, but that's anxiety too, that sort of emotional cutoff.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why I like this is like more of a spectrum and a scale, because I do think that trips people up, and right, Bernard talks a lot about it's more about the intensity of an action than it is what it looks like. So extreme fusion and enmeshment is the same as cutoff, because right, it's the same extreme intensity, but they look very, very different. So that's why sometimes people might say like, right, I've cut those people off, I don't have anything to do with them, they have no effect on me. Well, I would say no, I think they're probably still having a lot of effect on your energy, right? Because it takes a lot of energy to maintain cutoff. So two sides of the same coin, which is another reason why I like Bowen, like it helps you think about some of these things maybe differently. But I would say, yeah, you have to have a lot of anxiety to have to cut off someone, especially a family member. That takes a lot of strong emotion. And then to maintain that, does that track for you guys too?
I think you could add there too, a lot of emotion comes from being cut off, because then it's not your choice at all.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree, because I think that's a lot to manage, right? You're probably very anxious because you're feeling like, if I'm the one cut off, what do I even do about this? So I have all this energy, all these thoughts and emotions, and nowhere to put it. Mm-hmm. And that's hard because we're wanting the balance of individuality and togetherness. You can't have that if, the relationship is cut off and in that kind of pattern. Yeah, good point. All right, so the next, we'll talk clinically in a second. Kind of just summarizing, like I said, I don't have a ton to talk about, but I just wanted to kind of highlight that that's why I think sometimes I'll see, right, clinically or in notes, people talking about, the goal is to increase someone's anxiety or increase their differentiation of self, yada, yada, right? And I think probably the better goal is how can we work to decrease the emotional anxiety in the system, the chronic anxiety, or really, like we talked about, is how do we work to increase people's ability to tolerate anxiety? And with that comes an increased differentiation of self in that particular system, right? And hopefully in many systems if we get there isomorphically. Because I do think, right, no matter how well differentiated you are, if the anxiety is high enough, you will act emotionally with fusion of your emotion and intellect, right? Symptoms will occur if the anxiety is high enough in the system. So if your goal is let's get people this perfect level of differentiation, that's great. But if it's high enough, I don't know anyone who's not gonna feel symptomatic or start to present like that. It might be a lot less, they might have a lot more tools, but that's gonna happen. And as we talked about, the more that's there, the less ability there is to be thoughtful, see multiple points of view. It's not about not having a reaction, right? You're gonna have a reaction, people are human, that's there. But it's, can we see things and be calm and see things in multiple ways? if that's required for being differentiated, then we've got to find a way to learn this anxiety tolerance so that people can have the option to be in that way, no matter what system they're in. So I do think that that's kind of a lot of times, especially when we talk clinically, right, a better goal or a way to think about it. Because I think sometimes people can get spinning their wheels, especially if, you know, all work systemic, but if we're working with an individual and not a family system in the room, it can be easy to kind of think, well, okay, I need to work on increasing your level of differentiation, but kind of the way to go, I guess this is more of a reminder for all of us that, like, I think anxiety is a lot of the key to that. And then that happens as an aspect of that. But that's sort of what it takes to even get there and make those things possible for people.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
What are, I don't know if you're going to cover this, but what would be some of the ways that you would, you know, some of the ways that you would coach or a client to help them decrease the anxiety?
So this is the hard part, right? And I'm not going to cover it because it becomes, if you tell your client how to do it, then that's you taking on the anxiety and doing it for them, right? Like it's the most annoying thing in the world. And I think the reason why to do Bowen therapy, you really have to have, you know, done your work yourself and have good anxiety tolerance. Because the only way they can learn it is to learn for themselves what they look like. If it kind of makes sense, right? They have to manage the anxiety of not knowing how to manage the anxiety to figure out what that looks like for them. Because I think oftentimes saying, right, people look at me, okay, well, cool. How do I do that? What do I need to do? And you feel like a jerk, and you're kind of like, part of the thing is you've got to sit in it and figure out what you need to do. If I do it for you, you're spreading your anxiety to me and getting me pulled, right? Then we're in the other Bowen concepts, right? If you're getting me triangulated and pulled in and a part of that anxious system, they're asking me to decrease their own anxiety, you know, and really the only way to let them, you're really just allowing them the space to do that work for themselves. But then that's causing anxiety in you as the therapist. Or I'll speak for myself, it sure does in me, right? Because we want to be helpful. We want to be with people in that space. You know, that's what we think we're trained to do. And then you have to kind of do the Yoda flip it on them, like, well, I can't really tell you that. And then their anxiety increases. Go ahead, sorry.
I was just gonna say that, is there a way that you, I mean, coaching doesn't necessarily mean that, and coaching may be the wrong word, but you could, like, you know, advise a client, guide a client. It's okay to sit with the feeling. In other words, that is like a form of coaching, but you're not necessarily taking it away for them, but you're setting a context for them so that they could feel safe going inside and sort of dealing with this, you know, dealing with their feelings themselves.
Yeah, I will say some of it you can still do that basic kind of attunement with them, knowing what they need. And I will say a lot of times we'll talk about a good place to start on any time of this work is, you know, being able to sit with your emotion and just increasing your awareness to what's happening. Yeah, I think you can't necessarily teach them the steps they're going to take to tolerate it, but yeah, you don't want to leave them totally, I think, a fish out of water, just, you know, drowning in it. But I think that's when you get to a sticky space of you don't want to do too much, but you also want to be sure you're with them, because you're inevitably a part of the system. You're triangulated and being pulled in some way. So yeah, I will say, yeah, and especially if someone can get my anxiety high enough, I'll normally say, well, a good place to start is, you know, awareness of your emotions and practicing sitting in them. And yeah, so it also just depends on that kind of stuff. Yeah. Rosemary, yes.
Hi. I was wondering, so from Bowen's perspective, to decrease anxiety, we don't provide the client with tools to decrease it. We just allow them to figure it out for themselves, or do we actually give them things that they can do to decrease the anxiety?
Yeah, it's not really a very intervention-based model to use. So yeah, you're not like doing like what you're doing in some of the others where you're giving these certain interventions or telling them certain activities or things to do.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Wanted to make sure I got it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can I pipe in for a minute?
Yeah.
One of the things that I think helps is when you're tracking the emotional system in the family, when you and the client are talking about, you know, even doing a genogram can really show the client it's not an enlightenment or an aha kind of change, but it is sort of them reflecting on what's happening for them given the emotional what is it, projection throughout the system, and that like just that kind of questioning hopefully helps them to understand and respond differently rather than react in their family. When they understand their reactivity and they change that reactivity to a chosen response, that is change.
Yeah.
So I think it's not giving them, go here, go do this, say this to your mother, but by understanding what's happening, they can choose to respond differently. And in that, there's change in the relationship. That's how I've understood it.
Yeah, I think me too. Beautifully said. And that's why you're doing a genogram with every client in this model. And you know, like Dr. Vaman just said, it's not that, and we know this, right? Clients think, oh, if I could just know enough insights, this magical key to change. Not necessarily, but my understanding of Bowen is that does, like she said, open the door to you having enough awareness to make different choices. And it is a lot of exploring the genogram. Oh, when that happens, how is this happening? Oh, we're seeing that this is a multi-generational process and not necessarily just a me thing or a you thing. And I think it does open that space. And then it's a lot, like I guess, like I said, to be repetitive, I guess, is providing the awareness and opportunity to people to do different. And then you're kind of space, and then it's on them, right? That's the famous whose anxiety is it? It's on them after that to make the choices that they need to make. And it's not on you as the therapist to determine what should or shouldn't be done because they're in their stuff. But yeah.
I just I'm reading like David Snarch, some of his stuff, and I don't know if he's strictly a Bowen person, but I know that his kind of marriage crucible sex therapy is
Constructing the Sexual Crucible and Passionate Marriage.
Yeah.
Those two books.
Yeah. So it's like influenced by Bowen. And one of the things that he gives couples to do is like this hugging to relax, where they're kind of hugging, but they both are going inside and sort of dealing with their own feelings that come up. You know, so it seemed to me like a way that he's sort of like teaching them to how to be in relation at the same time as to reduce your own level of anxiety.
Yeah, and man, I will admit right now, it's been a long time since I've read that book, but I have, and I've taught from it. So, and some of the things he will guide them to do is like that, like, right, instead of not thinking about certain things, you're actually moving towards thinking about them and learning to tolerate it when it comes to sexual dysfunction things, right? And really, right, he has the metaphor of golly, it's like not the pot, but you know what I mean, like where you're kind of creating the space and the couple's in it and you're kind of helping maintain the pressure in that while
the crucible.
Yeah. So and that really is it's the very Bowenian metaphor for that, where that's kind of what you're doing. You're creating that space, probably giving some sort of minor tools and opportunities for them, and then really just like, you know, giving them the chance to do the work within that, the crucible, the pressure there.
Well, the crucible is such a lovely metaphor because it's in the crucible that the gold is refined. So it burns out all of the impurities. So that's the crucible is not just boiling you up and hurting you, it's refining you.
Yeah, which is everything, and I think in therapy in general is the only way out is through, you know, and all of us, of course, no one likes the pain or the uncomfortableness, but that is the process that must be gone through to, you know, kind of refine and make the changes that need to be made. Unfortunately, you can't bypass that part. The intention's not to hurt, but it's also a necessary aspect of that kind of all of it coming together. That is constructing the sexual crucible. I'm just gonna say, I'm pretty sure I have it on my shelf here. I could show it to you, but
It was the first book I ever read in grad school because I started in the sex therapy class. And I was like, what the hell did I get myself into? It's still the hardest textbook I've ever read. Yeah. So Passionate Marriage of David Snarch's is a dumbed down constructing the sexual crucible. And yeah, and it's still kind of heady. Mm-hmm.
well, I'll tell on myself here that that's the book that we learned in my MFT master's program for sex therapy. So then when I taught sex therapy to different people, I thought, oh, well, like I'm going to teach what I know. And I taught it in like a Christian counseling more type program. And I thought they were just like going to die. Like just, it's so heavy and dense. And then the material, I was like, oh, okay. That was a big practice in anxiety tolerance for me of like, okay, I've committed to this road. We're going to learn this material. But yeah, it's a heavy book. But it's good. It's just dense. Okay. Well, that's all I have as far as that stuff. I would love to talk about cases. If any of you guys have cases or any specific kind of scenarios you want to talk, Bowen, and apply it to me, that's the most